This is from the journal of Lato II, rediscovered after thousands of years, hidden beneath the sands of Arrakis. I assure you that I am the book of fate. Questions are my enemies, for my questions explode. Answers leap up like a frightened flock, blackening the sky of my inescapable memories. Not one answer, not one suffices. What prisms flash when I enter the terrible field of my past? I am a chip of shattered flint, enclosed in a box. The box gyrates and quakes. I am tossed about in a storm of mysteries, and when the box opens, I return to this presence like a stranger in a primitive land. Slowly, slowly, I say, I relearn my name, but that is not to know myself. This person of my name, this Lato, who is the second of that calling, finds other voices in his mind, other names and other places. Oh, I promise you, as I have been promised, that I answer to but a single name. If you say, Lato, I respond. Sufferance makes this true, sufferance and one thing more. I hold the threads. All of them are mine. Let me but imagine a topic, say, men who have died by the sword, and I have them in all their gore, every image intact, every moan, every grimace. Joys of motherhood, I think, and the birthing beds are mine. Serial baby smiles, and the sweet cooings of new generations. The first walkings of the toddlers, and the first victories of youths brought forth for me to share. They tumble one upon another until I can see little else but sameness and repetition. Keep it all intact, I warn myself. Who can deny the value of such experiences, the worth of learning through which I view each new instant? Ah, but it's the past. Don't you understand? It's only the past. Here is an excerpt from Lato II's stolen journals. This morning I was born in a yurt at the edge of a horse plain in a land of a planet which no longer exists. Tomorrow I will be born someone else in another place. I have not yet chosen. This morning, though, this life. When my eyes had learned to focus, I looked out at sunshine on trampled grass, and I saw vigorous people going about the sweet activities of their lives. Where has all of that vigor gone? The three people running northward through moon shadows in the forbidden forest were strung out along almost half a kilometer. The last runner in the line ran less than 100 meters ahead of the pursuing D-wolves. The animals could be heard yelping and panting in their eagerness, the way they do when they have the prey in sight. With first moon almost directly overhead, it was quite light in the forest, and, although these were the higher latitudes of Arrakis, it was still warm from the heat of a summer day. The nightly drift of air from the last desert of the Sareer carried rosin smells and the damp exhalations of the duff underfoot. Now and again, a breeze from the Kynes Sea beyond the Sareer drifted across the runner's tracks with hints of salt and fishes. By a quirk of fate, the last runner was called Ulat, which in the Fremen tongue means beloved straggler. Ulat was short in stature and with a tendency to fat, which had placed an extra dieting burden on him in training for this venture. Even when slimmed down for their desperate run, his face remained round, the large brown eyes vulnerable in that suggestion of too much flesh. To Ulat it was obvious that he could not run much farther. He panted and wheezed. Occasionally he staggered, but he did not call out to his companions. He knew they could not help him. All of them had taken the same oath, knowing they had no defenses except the old virtues and Fremen loyalties. This remained true, even though everything that once had been Fremen had now a museum quality. Rote recitals learned from museum Fremen. It was Fremen loyalty that kept Ulat silent in the full awareness of his doom. A fine display of the ancient qualities, and rather pitiful when none of the runners had any but book knowledge and the legends of the oral history about the virtues they aped. The dee-wolves ran close behind Ulat, giant gray figures almost man-height at the shoulders. They leaped and whined in their eagerness, heads lifted, eyes focused on the moon-betrayed figure of their quarry. A root caught Ulat's left foot, and he almost fell. This gave him renewed energy. He put on a burst of speed, gaining perhaps a wolf length on his pursuers. His arms pumped. He breathed noisily through his open mouth. The dee-wolves did not change pace. They were silver shadows which went flick-flick through the loud green smells of their forest. They knew they had won. It was a familiar experience. Again, Ulat stumbled. He caught his balance against a sapling and continued his panting flight, gasping, his legs trembling in rebellion against these demands. No energy remained for another burst of speed. One of the dee-wolves, a large female, moved out on Ulat's left flank. She swerved inward and leaped across his path. Giant fangs ripped Ulat's shoulder and staggered him, but he did not fall. The pungency of blood was added to the forest smells. A smaller male caught his right hip, and at last Ulat fell, screaming. The pack pounced, and his screams were cut off in abrupt finality. Not stopping to feed, the dee-wolves again took up the chase. Their noses probed the forest floor and the vagrant eddies in the air, scenting the warm tracery of two more running humans. The next runner in the line was named Kuteg, an old and honorable name on Arrakis, a name from the Dune times. An ancestor had served C.H. Taber as master of the Death Stills, but that was more than 3,000 years lost in a past which many no longer believed. Kuteg ran with the long strides of a tall and slender body, which seemed perfectly fitted to such exertion. Long black hair streamed back from his aquiline features. As with his companions, he wore a black running suit of tightly knitted cotton. It revealed the workings of his buttocks and stringy thighs, the deep and steady rhythm of his breathing. Only his pace, which was markedly slow for Kuteg, betrayed the fact that he had injured his right knee coming down from the man-made precipices which girdled the God Emperor's citadel fortress in the Sareer. Kuteg heard Ulat's screams, the abrupt and potent silence, then the renewed chase yelps of the dee-wolves. He tried not to let his mind create the image of another friend being slain by Lato's monster guardians, but imagination worked its sorcery on him. Kuteg thought a curse against the tyrant, but wasted no breath to voice it. There remained a chance that he could reach the sanctuary of the Idaho River. Kuteg knew what his friends thought about him, even Siona. He had always been known as a conservative. Even as a child, he had saved his energy until it counted most, parceling out his reserves like a miser. In spite of the injured knee, Kuteg increased his pace. He knew the river was near. His injury had gone beyond agony into a steady flame which filled his entire leg and side with its burning. He knew the limits of his endurance. He knew also that Siona should be almost at the water. The fastest runner of them all, she carried the sealed packet, and in it the things they had stolen from the fortress in the Sareer. Kuteg focused his thoughts on that packet as he ran. Save it, Siona. Use it to destroy him. The eager whining of the dee-wolves penetrated Kuteg's consciousness. They were too close. He knew then that he would not escape. But Siona must escape. He risked a backward glance and saw one of the wolves move to flank him. The pattern of their attack plan imprinted itself on his awareness. As the flanking wolf leaped, Kuteg also leaped. Placing a tree between himself and the pack, he ducked beneath the flanking wolf, grasped one of its hind legs in both hands, and, without stopping, whirled the captive wolf as a flail which scattered the others. Finding the creature not as heavy as he had expected, almost welcoming the change of action, he flailed his living bludgeon at the attackers in a dervish whirl which brought two of them down in a crash of skulls. But he could not guard every side. A lean male caught him in the back, hurling him against a tree, and he lost his bludgeon. "Go!" he screamed. The pack bored in, and Kuteg caught the throat of the lean male in his teeth. He bit down with every gram of his final desperation. Wolf blood spurted over his face, blinding him. Rolling without any knowledge of where he went, Kuteg grappled another wolf. Part of the pack dissolved into a yelping, whirling mob, some turning against their own injured. Most of the pack remained intent on the quarry, though. Teeth ripped Kuteg's throat from both sides. Siona, too, had heard Ulat scream, then the unmistakable silence followed by the yelping of the pack as the wolves resumed the chase. Such anger filled her that she felt she might explode with it. Ulat had been included in this venture because of his analytical ability, his way of seeing a whole from only a few parts. It had been Ulat who, taking the inevitable magnifier from his kit, had examined the two strange volumes they had found in with the Citadel's plans. "I think it's a cipher," Ulat had said. And Raddy, poor Raddy, who had been the first of their team to die, Raddy had said, "We can't afford the extra weight. Throw them away." Ulat had objected. "Unimportant things aren't concealed this way." Kuteg had joined Raddy. "We came for the Citadel plans and we have them. Those things are too heavy." But Siona had agreed with Ulat. "I will carry them." That had ended the argument. Poor Ulat. They had all known him as the worst runner in the team. Ulat was slow in most things, but the clarity of his mind could not be denied. He is trustworthy. Ulat had been trustworthy. Siona mastered her anger and used its energy to increase her pace. Trees whipped past her in the moonlight. She had entered that timeless void of the running when there was nothing else but her own movements, her own body, doing what it had been conditioned to do. Men thought her beautiful when she ran. Siona knew this. Her long dark hair was tied tightly to keep it from whipping in the wind of her passage. She had accused Kuteg of foolishness when he had refused to copy her style. Where is Kuteg? Her hair was not like Kuteg's. It was that deep brown which is sometimes confused with black, but is not truly black, not like Kuteg's at all. In the way genes occasionally do, her features copied those of a long-dead ancestor. Gently oval and with a generous mouth, eyes of alert awareness above a small nose. Her body had grown lanky from years of running, but it sent strong sexual signals to the males around her. Where is Kuteg? The wolf pack had fallen silent, and this filled her with alarm. They had done that before bringing down Raddy. It had been the same when they got Sareer. She told herself the silence could mean other things. Kuteg, too, was silent and strong. The injury had not appeared to bother him too much. Siona began to feel pain in her chest, the gasping to come, which she knew well from the long kilometers of training. Perspiration still poured down her body under the thin black running garment. The kit, with its precious contents sealed against the river passage ahead, rode high on her back. She thought about the Citadel charts folded there. Where does Lato hide his hoard of spice? It had to be somewhere within the Citadel. It had to be. Somewhere in the charts there would be a clue. The melange spice for which the Bene Gesserit, the Guild, and all the others hungered, that was a prize worth this risk. And those two cryptic volumes. Kuteg had been right in one thing. Redulian crystal paper was heavy, but she shared Ulat's excitement. Something important was concealed in those lines of cipher. Once more the eager chase yelps of the wolves sounded in the forest behind her. "Run, Kuteg, run!" Now, just ahead of her through the trees, she could see the wide, cleared strip which bordered the Idaho River. She glimpsed moon brightness on water beyond the clearing. "Run, Kuteg!" She longed for a sound from Kuteg, any sound. Only the two of them remained now from the 11 who had started the run. 9 had paid for this venture with their lives. Raddy, Aline, Ulat, Sareer, Ineneg, Onemau, Hoche, Memar, and Oala. Siona thought their names and, with each, sent a silent prayer to the old gods, not to the tyrant Lato, especially she prayed to Shai-Hulud. I pray to Shai-Hulud, who lives in the sand. Abruptly, she was out of the forest and onto the moon-bright stretch of mowed ground along the river. Straight ahead, beyond a narrow shingle of beach, the water beckoned to her. The beach was silver against the oily flow. A loud yell from back in the trees almost made her falter. She recognized Kuteg's voice above the wild wolf sounds. Kuteg called out to her without name, an unmistakable cry with one word containing countless conversations, a message of death and life. Go! The pack sounds took on a terrible commotion of frenzied yelps, but nothing more from Kuteg. She knew then how Kuteg was spending the last energies of his life, delaying them to help me escape. Obeying Kuteg's cry, she dashed to the river's edge and plunged headfirst into the water. The river was a freezing shock after the heat of the run. It stunned her for a moment, and she floundered outward, struggling to swim and regain her breath. The precious kit floated and bumped against the back of her head. The Idaho River was not wide here, no more than 50 meters, a gently sweeping curve with sandy indentations fringed by roots and shelving banks of lush reeds and grass where the water refused to stay in the straight lines Lato's engineers had designed. Siona was strengthened by the knowledge that the D-wolves had been conditioned to stop at the water. Their territorial boundaries had been drawn, the river on this side and the desert wall on the other side. Still, she swam the last few meters underwater and surfaced in the shadows of a cut bank before turning and looking back. The wolf pack stood ranged along the bank, all except one, which had come down to the river's edge. It leaned forward with its forefeet almost into the flow. She heard it whine. Siona knew the wolf saw her, no doubt of that. D-wolves were noted for their keen eyesight. There were gaze hounds in the ancestry of Lato's forest guardians, and he bred the wolves for their eyesight. She wondered if this once the wolves might break through their conditioning. They were mostly sight hunters. If that one wolf at the river's edge should enter the water, all might follow. Siona held her breath. She felt the dragging of exhaustion. They had come almost 30 kilometers, the last half of it with the D-wolves close behind. The wolf at the river's edge whined once more, then leaped back up to its companions. At some silent signal, they turned and loped back into the forest. Siona knew where they would go. D-wolves were allowed to eat anything they brought down in the forbidden forest. Everyone knew this. It was why the wolves roamed the forest, the guardians of the Sareer. "You'll pay for this, Lato," she whispered. It was a low sound, her voice, very close to the quiet rustling of the water against the reeds just behind her. "You'll pay for Ulat, for Kuteg, and for all the others. You'll pay." She pushed outward gently and drifted with the current until her feet met the first shelving of a narrow beach. Slowly, her body dragged down by fatigue, she climbed from the water and paused to check that the sealed contents of her kit had remained dry. The seal was unbroken. She stared at it a moment in the moonlight, then lifted her gaze to the forest wall across the river. The price we paid. 10 dear friends. Tears glimmered in her eyes, but she had the stuff of the ancient Fremen, and her tears were few. The venture across the river directly through the forest while the wolves patrolled the northern boundaries, then across the last desert of the Sareer and over the citadel's ramparts. All of this already was assuming dream proportions in her mind. Even the flight from the wolves, which she had anticipated, because it was a certainty that the guardian pack would cross the track of the invaders and be waiting. All a dream. It was the past. I escaped. She restored the kit with its sealed packet and fastened it once more against her back. "I have broken through your defenses, Lato." Siona thought then about the cryptic volumes. She felt certain that something hidden in those lines of cipher would open the way for her revenge. "I will destroy you, Lato." Not, "We will destroy you." That was not Siona's way. She would do it herself. She turned and strode toward the orchards beyond the river's mowed border. As she walked, she repeated her oath, adding to it aloud the old Fremen formula, which terminated in her full name. "Siona ibn Fuad al-Sayefa Atreides it is who curses you, Lato. You will pay in full." The following is from the Hadi Benoto translation of the volumes discovered at Dar es Balat. I was born Lato Atreides II, more than 3,000 standard years ago, measuring from the moment when I caused these words to be printed. My father was Paul Muad'Dib. My mother was his Fremen consort, Chani. My maternal grandmother was Farula, a noted herbalist among the Fremen. My paternal grandmother was Jessica, a product of the Bene Gesserit breeding scheme in their search for a male who could share the powers of the sisterhood's reverend mothers. My maternal grandfather was Liet Kynes, the planetologist who organized the ecological transformation of Arrakis. My paternal grandfather was the Atreides, descendant of the house of Atreus, and tracing his ancestry directly back to the Greek original. Enough of these begats. My paternal grandfather died as many good Greeks did, attempting to kill his mortal enemy, the old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Both of them rest uncomfortably now in my ancestral memories. Even my father is not content. I have done what he feared to do, and now his shade must share in the consequences. The golden path demands it. And what is the golden path, you ask? It is the survival of humankind, nothing more nor less. We who have prescience, we who know the pitfalls in our human futures, this has always been our responsibility, survival. How you feel about this, your petty woes and joys, even your agonies and raptures, seldom concerns us. My father had this power. I have it stronger. We can peer now and again through the veils of time. This planet of Arrakis, from which I direct my multigalactic empire, is no longer what it was in the days when it was known as Dune. In those days, the entire planet was a desert. Now, there is just this little remnant, my Sareer. No longer does the giant sandworm roam free, producing the spice melange, the spice. Dune was noteworthy only as the source of melange, the only source. What an extraordinary substance. No laboratory has ever been able to duplicate it, and it is the most valuable substance humankind has ever found. Without melange to ignite the linear prescience of guild navigators, people cross the parsecs of space only at a snail's crawl. Without melange, the Bene Gesserit cannot endow truthsayers or reverend mothers. Without the geriatric properties of melange, people live and die according to the ancient measure, no more than 100 years or so. Now, the only spice is held in guild and Bene Gesserit storehouses, a few small hoards among the remnants of the great houses, and my gigantic hoard, which they all covet. How they would like to raid me, but they don't dare. They know I would destroy it all before surrendering it. No, they come hat in hand and petition me for melange. I dole it out as a reward and hold it back as punishment. How they hate that! It is my power, I tell them. It is my gift. With it I create peace. They have had more than 3,000 years of Lato's peace. It is an enforced tranquility, which humankind knew only for the briefest periods before my ascendancy. Lest you have forgotten, study Lato's peace once more in these, my journals. I began this account in the first year of my stewardship, in the first throes of my metamorphosis, when I was still mostly human, even visibly so. The sand trout skin which I accepted, and my father refused, and which gave me greatly amplified strength plus virtual immunity from conventional attack and aging, that skin still covered a form recognizably human, 2 legs, 2 arms, a human face framed in the scrolled folds of the sand trout. Ah, that face! I still have it. The only human skin I exposed to the universe. All the rest of my flesh has remained covered by the linked bodies of those tiny deep sand vectors which one day can become giant sandworms, as they will someday. I often think about my final metamorphosis, that likeness of death. I know the way it must come, but I do not know the moment or the other players. This is the one thing I cannot know. I only know whether the golden path continues or ends. As I cause these words to be recorded, the golden path continues, and for that, at least, I am content. I no longer feel the sand trout cilia probing my flesh, encapsulating the water of my body within their placental barriers. We are virtually one body now, they my skin, and I the force which moves the whole, most of the time. At this writing, the whole could be considered rather gross. I am what could be called a pre-worm. My body is about 7 meters long and somewhat more than 2 meters in diameter, ribbed for most of its length, with my Atreides face positioned man-height at one end, the arms and hands, still quite recognizable as human, just below. My legs and feet, well, they are mostly atrophied, just flippers really, and they have wandered back along my body. The whole of me weighs approximately 5 old tons. These items I append because I know they will have historical interest. How do I carry this weight around? Mostly on my royal cart, which is of Ixian manufacture. You are shocked. People invariably hated and feared the Ixians even more than they hated and feared me. Better the devil you know. And who knows what the Ixians might manufacture or invent? Who knows? I certainly don't, not all of it. But I have a certain sympathy for the Ixians. They believe so strongly in their technology, their science, their machines. Because we believe, no matter the content, we understand each other, the Ixians and I. They make many devices for me, and think they earn my gratitude thus. These very words you are reading were printed by an Ixian device. A dictatel, it is called. If I cast my thoughts in a particular mode, the dictatel is activated. I merely think in this mode, and the words are printed for me on Redulian crystal sheets, only 1 molecule thick. Sometimes I order copies printed on material of lesser permanence. It was 2 of these latter types that were stolen from me by Siona. Isn't she fascinating, my Siona? As you come to understand her importance to me, you may even question whether I really would have let her die there in the forest. Have no doubt about it. Death is a very personal thing. I will seldom interfere with it. Never in the case of someone who must be treated as Siona requires. I could let her die at any stage. After all, I could bring up a new candidate in very little time as I measure time. She fascinates even me, though. I watched her there in the forest, through my Ixian devices. I watched her, wondering why I had not anticipated this venture. But Siona is Siona. That is why I made no move to stop the wolves. It would have been wrong to do that. The D-wolves are but an extension of my purpose, and my purpose is to be the greatest predator ever known. The following brief dialogue is credited to a manuscript source called the Welbeck Fragment. The reputed author is Siona Atreides. The participants are Siona herself and her father Moneo, who was, as all the histories tell us, a major domo and chief aide to Lato II. It is dated at a time when Siona was still in her teens and was being visited by her father at her quarters in the Fish Speakers School at the festival city of On, a major population center on the planet now known as Arrakis. According to the manuscript identification papers, Moneo had visited his daughter secretly to warn her that she risked destruction. Siona. How have you survived with him for so long a time, father? He kills those who are close to him. Everyone knows that. Moneo. No, you are wrong. He kills no one. Siona. You needn't lie about him. Moneo. I mean it. He kills no one. Siona. Then how do you account for the known deaths? Moneo. It is the worm that kills. The worm is God. Lato lives in the bosom of God, but he kills no one. Siona. Then how do you survive? Moneo. I can recognize the worm. I can see it in his face and in his movements. I know when Shai-Hulud approaches. Siona. He is not Shai-Hulud. Moneo. Well, that's what they called the worm in the Fremen days. Siona. I've read about that, but he is not the god of the desert. Moneo. Be quiet, you foolish girl. You know nothing of such things. Siona. I know that you are a coward. Moneo. How little you know. You have never stood where I have stood and seen it in his eyes, in the movements of his hands. Siona. What do you do when the worm approaches? Moneo. I leave. Siona. That's prudent. He has killed 9 Duncan Idahos that we know about for sure. Moneo. I tell you he kills no one. Siona. What's the difference? Lato or worm? They are one body now. Moneo. But they are 2 separate beings. Lato the emperor and the worm who is God. Siona. You're mad. Moneo. Perhaps, but I do serve God. This is Lato's encounter with a new Duncan Idaho. And we begin with the inscription on the storehouse at Dar es Belat. You, the first person to encounter my chronicles for at least 4,000 years, beware. Do not feel honored by your primacy in reading the revelations of my Ixian storehouse. You will find much pain in it. Other than the few glimpses required to assure me that the golden path continued, I never wanted to peer beyond those 4 millennia. Therefore I am not sure what the events in my journals may signify to your times. I only know that my journals have suffered oblivion, and that the events which I recount have undoubtedly been submitted to historical distortion for eons. I assure you that the ability to view our futures can become a bore. Even to be thought of as a god, as I certainly was, can become ultimately boring. It has occurred to me more than once that holy boredom is good and sufficient reason for the invention of free will. I am Duncan Idaho. That was about all he wanted to know for sure. He did not like the Tleilaxu explanations, their stories, but then the Tleilaxu had always been feared, disbelieved and feared. They had brought him down to the planet on a small guild shuttle, arriving at the dusk line with a green glimmer of sun corona along the horizon as they dipped into the shadow. The spaceport had not looked at all like anything he remembered. It was larger, and with a ring of strange buildings. "Are you sure this is Dune?" he had asked. Arrakis, his Tleilaxu escort, had corrected him. They had sped him in a sealed ground car to this building somewhere within a city they called On, giving the N sound a strange rising nasal inflection. On. The room in which they left him was about 3 meters square, a cube really. There was no sign of glow globes, but the place was filled with warm yellow light. I am a Gola, he told himself. That had been a shock, but he had to believe it. To find himself living when he knew he had died, that was proof enough. The Tleilaxu had taken cells from his dead flesh, and they had grown a bud in one of their axolotl tanks. That bud had become this body in a process which had made him feel at first an alien in his own flesh. He looked down at the body. It was clothed in dark brown trousers and jacket of a coarse weave which irritated his skin. Sandals protected his feet. Except for the body, that was all they had given him, a parsimony which said something about the real Tleilaxu character. There was no furniture in the room. They had let him in through a single door, which had no handle on the inside. He looked up at the ceiling and around at the walls, at the door. Despite the featureless character of the place, he felt that he was being watched. "Women of the Imperial Guard will come for you," they had said. Then they had gone away, smiling slyly among themselves. Women of the Imperial Guard? The Tleilaxu escort had taken sadistic delight in exposing their shape-changing abilities. He had not known from one minute to the next what new form the plastic flow of their flesh would present. Damned face dancers! They had known all about him, of course, had known how much the shape-changers disgusted him. What could he trust if it came from face dancers? Very little. Could anything they said be believed? "My name. I know my name." And he had his memories. They had shocked the identity back into him. Golas were supposed to be incapable of recovering the original identity. But the Tleilaxu had done it, and he was forced to believe because he understood how it had been done. In the beginning, he knew, there had been the fully formed Gola adult flesh, without name or memories, a palimpsest upon which the Tleilaxu could write almost anything they wished. "You are Gola," they had said. That had been his only name for a long time. Gola had been taken like a malleable infant and conditioned to kill a particular man, a man so like the original Paul Muad'Dib he had served and adored that Idaho now suspected it might have been another Gola. But if that were true, where had they obtained the original cells? Something in the Idaho cells had rebelled at killing an Atreides. He had found himself standing with a knife in one hand, the bound form of the pseudo-Paul staring up at him in angry terror. Memories had gushed into his awareness. He remembered Gola, and he remembered Duncan Idaho. "I am Duncan Idaho, Swordmaster of the Atreides." He clung to this memory as he stood in the yellow room. "I died defending Paul and his mother in a cave siege beneath the sands of Dune. I have been returned to that planet, but Dune is no more. Now it is only Arrakis." He had read the truncated history which the Tleilaxu provided, but he did not believe it. More than 3,500 years? Who could believe his flesh existed after such a time? Except with Tleilaxu it was possible. He had to believe his own senses. "There have been many of you," his instructors had said. How many? "The Lord Lato will provide that information." The Lord Lato? The Tleilaxu history said this Lord Lato was Lato II, grandson of the Lato whom Idaho had served with fanatical devotion. But this second Lato, so the history said, had become something so strange that Idaho despaired of understanding the transformation. How could a human slowly turn into a sandworm? How could any thinking creature live more than 3,000 years? Not even the wildest projections of geriatric spice allowed such a lifespan. Lato II, the God Emperor? The Tleilaxu history was not to be believed. Idaho remembered a strange child, twins really, Lato and Ghanima, Paul's children, the children of Cheney, who had died delivering them. The Tleilaxu history said Ghanima had died after a relatively normal life, but the God Emperor Lato lived on and on and on. "He is a tyrant," Idaho's instructors had said. "He has ordered us to produce you from our axolotl tanks and to send you into his service. We do not know what has happened to your predecessor." And here I am. Once more Idaho let his gaze wander around the featureless walls and ceiling. The faint sound of voices intruded upon his awareness. He looked at the door. The voices were muted, but at least one of them sounded female. Women of the Imperial Guard? The door swung inward on noiseless hinges. Two women entered. The first thing to catch his attention was the fact that one of the women wore a mask, a cebus hood of shapeless, light-drinking black. She would see him clearly through the hood, he knew, but her features would never reveal themselves, not even to the most subtle instruments of penetration. The hood said that the Ixians or their inheritors were still at work in the Imperium. Both women wore one-piece uniforms of rich blue, with the Atreides hawk in red braid at the left breast. Idaho studied them as they closed the door and faced him. The masked woman had a blocky, powerful body. She moved with the deceptive care of a professional muscle fanatic. The other woman was graceful and slender, with almond eyes and sharp, high-boned features. Idaho had the feeling that he had seen her somewhere, but he could not fix the memory. Both women carried needle knives and hip sheaths. Something about their movements told Idaho these women would be extremely competent with such weapons. The slender one spoke first. "My name is Luli. Let me be the first to address you as Commander. My companion must remain anonymous. Our Lord Lato has commanded it." "Commander?" he asked. "It is the Lord Lato's wish that you command his royal guard," Luli said. "That's so. Let's go talk to him about it." "Oh, no!" Luli was visibly shocked. "The Lord Lato will summon you when it is time. For now, he wishes us to make you comfortable and happy." "And I must obey?" Luli merely shook her head in puzzlement. "Am I a slave?" Luli relaxed and smiled. "By no means. It's just that the Lord Lato has many great concerns which require his personal attention. He must make time for you. He sent us because he was concerned about his Duncan Idaho." He was concerned, though, by a particular reference in Luli's explanation. "His Duncan Idaho? Are you not an Atreides warrior?" Luli asked. She had him there. Idaho nodded, turning his head slightly to stare at the enigmatic masked woman. "Why are you masked?" "It must not be known that I serve the Lord Lato," she said. Her voice was a pleasant contralto, but Idaho suspected that this, too, was masked by the Cebus hood. "Then why are you here?" "The Lord Lato trusts me to determine if you have been tampered with by the dirty Tleilaxu." Idaho tried to swallow in a suddenly dry throat. This thought had occurred to him several times aboard the Guild transport. If the Tleilaxu could condition a Gola to attempt the murder of a dear friend, what else might they plant in the psyche of the regrown flesh? "I see that you have thought about this," the masked woman said. "Are you a Mentat?" Idaho asked. "Oh, no," Luli interrupted. "The Lord Lato does not permit the training of Mentats." Idaho glanced at Luli, then returned his attention to the masked woman. "No Mentats?" The Tleilaxu history had not mentioned that interesting fact. Why would Lato prohibit Mentats? Surely the human mind, trained in the super abilities of computation, still had its uses. The Tleilaxu had assured him that the Great Convention remained in force, and that mechanical computers were still anathema. Surely these women would know that the Atreides themselves had used Mentats. "What is your opinion?" the masked woman asked. "Have the dirty Tleilaxu tampered with your psyche?" "I don't think so." "But you are not certain?" "No." "Do not fear, Commander Idaho," she said. "We have ways of making sure, and ways of dealing with such problems should they arise. The dirty Tleilaxu have tried it only once, and they paid dearly for their mistake." "That's reassuring. Did the Lord Lato send me any messages?" Luli spoke up. "He told us to assure you that he still loves you, as the Atreides have always loved you." She was obviously awed by her own words. Idaho relaxed slightly. As an old Atreides hand, superbly trained by them, he had found it easy to determine several things from this encounter. These two had been heavily conditioned to a fanatic obedience. If a Cebus mask could hide the identity of that woman, there had to be many more whose bodies were very similar. All of this spoke of dangers around Lato, which still required the old and subtle services of spies and an imaginative arsenal of weapons. Luli looked at her companion. "What say you, friend?" "He may be brought to the citadel," the masked woman said. "This is not a good place. Tleilaxu have been here." "A warm bath and a change of clothing would be pleasant," Idaho said. Luli continued to look at her friend. "You are certain?" "The wisdom of the Lord cannot be questioned," the masked woman said. Idaho did not like the sound of fanaticism in this friend's voice, but he felt secure in the integrity of the Atreides. They could appear cynical and cruel to outsiders and enemies, but to their own people they were just and they were loyal. Above all else, the Atreides were loyal to their own. And I am one of theirs, Idaho thought. But what happened to the me that I am replacing? He felt strongly that these two would not answer this question. But Lato will. "Shall we go?" he asked. "I'm anxious to wash the stink of the dirty Tleilaxu off me." Luli grinned at him. "Come, I shall bathe you myself." You must remember that I have at my internal demand every expertise known to our history. This is the fund of energy I draw upon when I address the mentality of war. If you have not heard the moaning cries of the wounded and the dying, you do not know about war. I have heard those cries in such numbers that they haunt me. I have cried out myself in the aftermath of battle. I have suffered wounds in every epoch, wounds from fist and club and rock, from shell-studded limb and bronze sword, from the mace and the cannon, from arrows and lace guns, and the silent smothering of atomic dust, from biological invasions which blacken the tongue and drown the lungs, from the swift gush of flame and the silent working of slow poisons, and more I will not recount. I have seen and felt them all. To those who dare ask why I behave as I do, I say, with my memories I can do nothing else. I am not a coward, and once I was human. In the warm season, when the satellite weather controllers were forced to contend with winds across the great seas, evening often saw rainfall at the edges of the Sareer. Maneo, coming in from one of his periodic inspections of the citadel's perimeter, was caught in a sudden shower. Night fell before he reached shelter. A fish-speaker guard helped him out of his damp cloak at the south portal. She was a heavy-set, blocky woman with a square face, a type Lato favored for his guardians. "Those damned weather controllers should be made to shape up," she said as she handed him his damp cloak. Maneo gave her a curt nod before beginning the climb to his quarters. All of the fish-speaker guards knew the God Emperor's aversion to moisture, but none of them had made Maneo's distinction. It is the worm who hates water, Maneo thought. Shai-Hulud hungers for Dune. In his quarters, Maneo dried himself and changed to dry clothing before descending to the crypt. There was no point in inviting the worm's antagonism. Uninterrupted conversation with Lato was required now. Plain talk about the impending peregrination to the festival city of On. Leaning against a wall of the descending lift, Maneo closed his eyes. Immediately, fatigue swept over him. He knew he had not slept enough in days, and there was no let-up in sight. He envied Lato's apparent freedom from the need for sleep. A few hours of semi-repose a month appeared to be sufficient for the God Emperor. The smell of the crypt and the stopping of the lift jarred Maneo from his catnap. He opened his eyes and looked out at the God Emperor on his cart in the center of the great chamber. Maneo composed himself and strode out for the familiar long walk into the terrible presence. As expected, Lato appeared alert. That at least was a good sign. Lato had heard the lift approaching and saw Maneo awaken. The man looked tired, and that was understandable. The peregrination to On was at hand, with all of the tiresome business of off-planet visitors, the ritual with the fish-speakers, the new ambassadors, the changing of the Imperial Guard, the retirements and the appointments, and now a new Duncan Idaho Gola to fit into the smooth working of the Imperial apparatus. Maneo was occupied with mounting details, and he was beginning to show his age. Let me see, Lato thought. Maneo will be 118 years old in the week after our return from On. The man could live many times that long if he would take the spice, but he refused. Lato had no doubt of the reason. Moneo had entered that peculiar human state where he longed for death. He lingered now only to see Siona installed in the royal service, the next director of the Imperial Society of Fish Speakers. My Auries, as Malky used to call them. And Moneo knew it was Lato's intention to breed Siona with a Duncan. It was time. Moneo stopped 2 paces from the cart and looked up at Lato. Something in his eyes reminded Lato of the look on the face of a pagan priest in the Terran times, a crafty supplication at the familiar shrine. "Lord, you have spent many hours observing the new Duncan," Moneo said. "Have the Tlilaxu tampered with his cells or his psyche?" "He is untainted." A deep sigh shook Moneo. There was no pleasure in it. "You object to his use as a stud?" Lato asked. "I find it peculiar to think of him as both an ancestor and the father of my descendants. But he gives me access to a first-generation cross between an older human form and the current products of my breeding program. Siona is 21 generations removed from such a cross. I fail to see the purpose. The Duncans are slower and less alert than anyone in your guard." "I am not looking for good segregant offspring, Moneo. Did you think me unaware of the progression geometrics dictated by the laws which govern my breeding program?" "I have seen your stock book, Lord." "Then you know that I keep track of the recessives and weed them out. The key genetic dominants are my concern." "And the mutations, Lord?" There was a sly note in Moneo's voice which caused Lato to study the man intently. "We will not discuss that subject, Moneo." Lato watched Moneo pull back into his cautious shell. How extremely sensitive he is to my moods, Lato thought. I do believe he has some of my abilities there, although they operate at an unconscious level. His question suggests that he may even suspect what we have achieved in Siona. Testing this, Lato said, "It is clear to me that you do not yet understand what I hope to achieve in my breeding program." Moneo brightened. "My lord knows I try to fathom the rules of it." "Laws tend to be temporary over the long haul, Moneo. There is no such thing as rule-governed creativity." "But, Lord, you yourself speak of laws which govern your breeding program." "What have I just said to you, Moneo? Trying to find rules for creation is like trying to separate mind from body." "But something is evolving, Lord. I know it in myself." "He knows it in himself. Dear Moneo, he is so close." "Why do you always seek after absolutely derivative translations, Moneo?" "I have heard you speak of transformational evolution, Lord. That is the label on your stock book. But what of surprise, Moneo? Rules change with each surprise." "Lord, have you no improvement of the human stock in mind?" Lato glared down at him, thinking, if I use the key word now, will he understand? Perhaps. "I am a predator, Moneo." Moneo broke off and shook his head. He knew the meaning of the word, he thought, but the word itself shocked him. Was the God Emperor joking? "Predator, Lord?" "The predator improves the stock." "How can this be, Lord? You do not hate us." "You disappoint me, Moneo. The predator does not hate its prey." "Predators kill, Lord." "I kill, but I do not hate. Prey assuages hunger. Prey is good." Moneo peered up at Lato's face in its gray cowl. Have I missed the approach of the worm? Moneo wondered. Fearfully, Moneo looked for the signs. There were no tremors in the giant body, no glazing of the eyes, no twisting of the useless flippers. "For what do you hunger, Lord?" Moneo ventured. "For a humankind which can make truly long-term decisions." "Do you know the key to that ability, Moneo?" "You have said it many times, Lord. It is the ability to change your mind." "Change, yes. And do you know what I mean by long-term?" For you it must be measured in millennia, Lord. Moneo, even my thousands of years are but a puny blip against infinity. But your perspective must be different from mine, Lord. In the view of infinity, any defined long term is short term. Then are there no rules at all, Lord? Moneo's voice conveyed a faint hint of hysteria. Lato smiled to ease the man's tension. Perhaps one. Short-term decisions tend to fail in the long term. Moneo shook his head in frustration. But, Lord, your perspective is time runs out for any finite observer. There are no closed systems. Even I only stretch the finite matrix. Moneo jerked his attention from Lato's face and peered into the distances of the mausoleum corridors. I will be here someday. The golden path may continue, but I will end. That was not important, of course. Only the golden path, which he could sense in unbroken continuity, only that mattered. He returned his attention to Lato, but not to the all-blue eyes. Was there truly a predator lurking in that gross body? You do not understand the function of a predator, Lato said. The words shocked Moneo because they smacked of mind-reading. He lifted his gaze to Lato's eyes. You know, intellectually, that even I will suffer a kind of death some day, Lato said, but you do not believe it. How can I believe what I will never see? Moneo had never felt more lonely and fearful. What was the God Emperor doing? I came down here to discuss the problem of the peregrination and to find out about his intentions toward Siona. Does he toy with me? Let us talk about Siona, Lato said. Mind-reading again? When will you test her, Lord? The question had been waiting in the front of his awareness all this time, but now that he had spoken it, Moneo feared it. Soon. Forgive me, Lord, but surely you know how much I fear for the well-being of my only child. Others have survived the test, Moneo. You did. Moneo gulped, remembering how he had been sensitized to the golden path. My mother prepared me. Siona has no mother. She has the fish speakers. She has you. Accidents happen, Lord. Tears sprang into Moneo's eyes. Lato looked away from him, thinking, he is torn by his loyalty to me and his love of Siona. How poignant it is, this concern for an offspring. Can he not see that all of humankind is my only child? Returning his attention to Moneo, Lato said, you are right to observe that accidents happen in my universe. Does this teach you nothing? Lord, just this once, couldn't you? Moneo! Surely you do not ask me to delegate authority to a weak administrator. Moneo recoiled one step. No, Lord, of course not. Then trust Siona's strength. Moneo squared his shoulders. I will do what I must. Siona must be awakened to her duties as an Atreides. Yes, of course, Lord. Is that not our commitment, Moneo? I do not deny it, Lord. When will you introduce her to the new Duncan? The test comes first. Moneo looked down at the cold floor of the crypt. He stares at the floor so often, Lato thought. What can he possibly see there? Is it the millennial tracks of my cart? Ah, no. It is into the depths that he peers, into the realm of treasure and mystery, which he expects to enter soon. Once more, Moneo lifted his gaze to Lato's face. I hope she will like the Duncan's company, Lord. Be assured of it. The Tleilaxu have brought him to me in the undistorted image. That is reassuring, Lord. No doubt you have noted that his genotype is remarkably attractive to females. That has been my observation, Lord. There's something about those gently observant eyes, those strong features, and that black goat hair, which positively melts the female psyche. As you say, Lord. You know he's with the fish speakers right now. I was informed, Lord. Lato smiled. Of course Maneo was informed. They will bring him to me soon for his first view of the God Emperor. I have inspected the viewing room personally, Lord. Everything is in readiness. Sometimes I think you wish to weaken me, Maneo. Leave some of these details for me. Maneo tried to conceal a constriction of fear. He bowed and backed away. Yes, Lord, but there are some things which I must do. Turning, he hurried away. It was not until he was ascending in the lift that Maneo realized he had left without being dismissed. He must know how tired I am. He will forgive. Odd as it may seem, great struggles, such as the one you can see emerging from my journals, are not always visible to the participants. Much depends on what people dream in the secrecy of their hearts. I have always been as concerned with the shaping of dreams as with the shaping of actions. Between the lines of my journals is the struggle with humankind's view of itself, a sweaty contest on a field where motives from our darkest past can well up out of an unconscious reservoir and become events with which we not only must live, but contend. It is the hydra-headed monster which always attacks from your blind side. I pray, therefore, that when you have traversed my portion of the golden path, you no longer will be innocent children dancing to music you cannot hear.